You know how it is, you want to stay informed, really get the nuances, but sometimes it just feels like overload, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Information everywhere.
Well, that's what we try to tackle here. Welcome back. We're doing another deep dive, looking at a set of sources, mostly a YouTube podcast transcript this time, to pull out the key stuff for you.
And today, we're zoning in on the Netherlands, specifically recent events, discussions, stuff around different communities interacting.
Yeah, things like freedom of speech, demonstration rights, immigration too, all with, the backdrop of what's happening internationally, Israel, Palestine, even things in South Africa coming up.
Right. So the mission, if you like, for you listening is to get a handle on these complexities, the different angles in the source material. We're not taking sides here.
No, definitely not. Just trying to understand what's being said, what the key points are, and maybe what it all means. Okay, let's get into it.
Okay, first up, Cat Week. There was this event, a jubilee celebrating Israel's statehood.
Right, in a church organized by Christians for Israel.
Exactly. But then you had opposition, a group called UMA for Gaza, Community of Muslims for Gaza.
Okay.
And their leader, Abu Hafs, the source mentions he has this alleged history, links to funneling money to IS.
Wow, okay, so that adds a layer. And he called on people to come to Catwick.
Yeah, the source says he used the term brothers, called them to come down, and it led to a confrontation.
But the really interesting bit from the source is how the locals reacted.
Oh, yeah, the Catwikers. Football fans, apparently from rival clubs who usually,
Fight like cats and dogs?
pretty much, yeah. But they actually came together, formed a kind of protective line around the church.
That's quite a statement.
It is. And Christopher, he's an MP, SGP party, conservative Protestant. He saw it happen.
And he was impressed.
Yeah, the source says he was proud that the locals basically said, look, people gathering here, Christians, Jews, Israel supporters, they can do that safely.
And this wasn't the first time Christians for Israel had issues.
No, the source mentions they've been targeted by activists before.
So this whole thing, it naturally sparked a big debate about protesting, right? Demonstration rights.
Exactly. On one side, people saying, hang on, maybe we need restrictions if protests are just there to provoke, intimidate, disrupt peaceful gatherings.
Makes sense.
But the counter-argument from the pro-Pali side, pro-Palestine activists, was apparently, no, we were just protesting peacefully, flags, loudspeakers, expressing our views.
But wasn't there something about online threats?
Yes, the source mentions calls online for Katwijk not to be safe, which, kind of complicates the peaceful protest claim.
Yeah, a bit. And this led to criticism of the government, like they were being naive.
That feeling comes through, yes. Specifically about handling pro-Palestine protesters, maybe not addressing things like masks being worn during demos.
Right.
So the source touches on ideas for stricter rules, like maybe designated protest zones further away from the actual target.
Keeping some distance.
And this links to a broader point in the source, that minority rights, like the right to demonstrate, come with responsibilities. They shouldn't be used to intimidate other minorities within that same democratic system.
That's a tricky balance.
Very. And the source throws in this idea that maybe some people coming from non-democratic backgrounds just don't have the same, ingrained understanding of democratic debate norms that exist in the Netherlands.
Interesting point. Is that where Christopher's call comes in? Asking political leaders, like from Denk?
Yes, asking them to tell their supporters to behave, quote, normally, meaning stick to the Dutch democratic legal framework. Don't disrupt meetings, don't disrupt church services.
Okay. And someone was reporting on this, a journalist.
Yeah, Marcel Vink. He was apparently there, so more reporting was expected.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears. Femke Halsema, the mayor of Amsterdam, her comments caused quite a stir.
They did. In the city council, she reportedly said Israel is murdering Palestinians using genocidal violence. Very strong language.
Very strong. And the reactions were, well, all over the place.
Completely. The source shows this contrast. Some residents feeling the city doesn't protect everyone equally, worries about discrimination.
Okay.
But then others saw Halsema's words as a, quote, complete reversal of facts, asking, who really feels unsafe in Amsterdam? Pointing to the Jewish community, Jewish schools needing security.
Right. That's a recurring point.
And there's this perception mentioned that maybe she was playing to her base, her left Islamic support base, possibly overlooking concerns of the Jewish population.
Politics, basically.
Well, that's one interpretation. The source also touches on the national government's actions regarding Israel, the foreign minister, looking into things, the stance on maybe arresting Netanyahu if he came to the Netherlands.
And Geert Wilders calls for her to be sacked, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And the source even floats this theory. Maybe Halsema's comments were strategic, positioning herself for a potential comeback to national politics later on.
Playing the long game, perhaps?
Maybe. The original hosts discussing this seemed a bit divided on her motives, how aware she was of the impact of her words.
But a key worry was that her rhetoric might, unintentionally maybe, give legitimacy to more extreme groups.
Exactly, like that UMA for Gaza group we talked about in Catwick, that her words could sort of validate their stance.
And this connects to the emotional reactions. Or the source mentioned a Denk representative getting very emotional about Gaza.
Yes, but then contrasted that with a perceived silence or lack of similar emotion regarding, say, the October 7th attacks.
Which leads into that really stark idea mentioned in the source.
Yeah.
The fifth column.
Yeah, this notion that some people might feel more connected to conflicts abroad or international groups than to their own country and its norms.
It's a heavy concept.
It is. And the argument follows that media authorities, especially mayors, they need to stay objective. Provide context on Israel-Palestine, the source specifically mentions, including the context of anti-Jewish sentiment in Gaza, and crucially, not fan the flames domestically.
But the view presented was that Halsema was fanning the flames, siding with a bloc driven by, what was the Dutch phrase?
Woede aan hat aan emotie. Anger, hate, and emotion. That was the characterization of the left Islamic bloc she was seen as aligning with.
And meanwhile, groups perceived as more objective or maybe pro-Israel like Christian for Israel, they face threats.
That's what the source indicates, yes. Intimidation for holding those views.
Okay. Let's move on to demographics and societal shifts.
Yeah.
There was a mention of a column predicting the Muslim population share.
Yeah, potentially 20% in the Netherlands by 2050, according to that source column.
And this led to a comparison, something about modern Islam in Saudi Arabia versus trends in the Netherlands.
Right. The source contrasts this idea of Islam modernizing in places like Saudi Arabia with what it describes as more conservative, maybe orthodox trends among Muslims in the Netherlands.
Interesting. And there was a parallel drawn with Turkish views or emigration.
Yeah, kind of like how Turkey might view Turks living abroad, or even historical examples like Dutch reformed people emigrating to Australia and apparently becoming more conservative over generations. It raises questions about integration, how identities evolve in new places.
So does this tie back to perceptions of Israel? The source asked if the Dutch view is changing, mentioning the Catwick locals again.
Yes, that until here and no further stance. The source is also careful to critique any idea of, like, vigilante action.
Right.
While still noting that perceived lack of government action. It's a complex picture.
And the mayor of Gatwick's reaction? The emergency decree was aimed at the locals, not the protesters.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. That the decree seemed to target the residents who formed the barrier rather than restricting the demonstrators who came to oppose the church event, which seems odd.
Very odd. And then there was that sarcastic comment about Eurovision.
Ah, yes. Voting for Israel as a form of protest or statement in itself.
Okay, let's broaden the scope now. International scene.
Oh.
Trump in the Middle East.
Right. His blessing tour, as the source called it. Big welcome in Saudi Arabia, apparently. Huge financial commitments mentioned, like $600 billion. Applause. The works.
And this was framed as a big policy shift.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Moving away from interventionism, more towards trade, business deals, Trump's stated goal of ending endless wars.
And less emphasis on human rights as a condition for deals.
That's the perception presented, yeah. Less focus on that. The source mentions a controversial meeting with Assad in Syria as part of this different approach.
What was the thinking behind that, strategically?
The source suggests it was about countering Iran's influence in the region.
Okay. And Qatar came up too. Investments in the U.S.
Substantial ones, yeah.
Yeah.
Universities, specifically. But also Qatar's complex role,
Yeah.
hosting certain international terrorist groups, which is obviously a major concern for Israel.
And the source highlighted a difference in how Trump was viewed. Europe versus the Middle East.
Big time. European left largely negative, but Middle Eastern leaders reportedly more positive. Why? Because they focus on national interest, realpolitik, practical considerations over ideology.
Makes sense from their perspective.
And the source ponders the long-term effects of the U.S. maybe pulling back militarily, but increasing economic ties.
What about Trump's view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself?
This source presents his view as basically seeing a lack of real willingness for peace from the Palestinian side.
And contrasted that with modernization elsewhere.
Yeah, places like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and also noting that other Arab nations haven't exactly rushed to support the Palestinian cause broadly.
But relations between Israel and some Arab states have improved.
Yes, the Abraham Accords are highlighted. The source implies maybe Trump's role in that wasn't fully appreciated in Europe.
And the overall European commentary on Trump?
Yeah.
The source was critical.
Yeah, predicting a kind of delayed recognition of what he actually achieved or shifted in the Middle East.
Okay, now a complete shift. South Africa. White Afrikaners seeking asylum in the U.S.
Right. The source gives a bit of background on the Afrikaners, Dutch settlers, European origins.
And the situation they face now. Discrimination, violence.
That's the picture painted. Under the ANC government, issues like racial laws and particularly these violent farm attacks.
Are those specifically targeting white farmers?
The source says it affects everyone, but white farmers are disproportionately affected just due to the demographics of who owns the farms. And the attacks themselves are described as often being incredibly brutal.
Grim. And Trump offered them asylum.
Yes, political asylum, citing persecution.
How did that go down?
Well, the source points to backlash, particularly from some on the left. It suggests this idea of intersectional ideology.
Right, where different identities intersect.
Exactly. It might make it hard for some within that framework to see white individuals as being persecuted because white is often positioned as the oppressor category.
Ideological blind spots, maybe?
Perhaps. But interestingly, the source notes very few Afrikaners actually took up the offer. Only 59 arrived in the U.S., apparently.
Why so few?
It suggests a disconnect. Maybe a desire for asylum in theory. But in practice, many Afrikaners actually want to stay in South Africa, trying to rebuild their communities there.
Okay, and this links back to Europe somehow. A precursor.
That's a really significant point raised in the source. The idea that the Afrikaner situation communities feeling they need to create their own structures for safety, for well-being, because they feel the government isn't helping or is even opposed, that this could be a sign of things to come in Europe.
The community's becoming more self-reliant out of necessity.
Yes. The source mentions the Afrikaners already have self-organized structures, security, schools, media, healthcare, sort of parallel systems.
Wow. Okay, final main topic then. Sint Anna-Parochie, a village in the Netherlands, and issues around an asylum seeker center, an AZC.
Right, there's a village festival coming up. But last year's festival, there was violence. Local kids reportedly stabbed by youths from the AZC.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So against that backdrop, the AZC apparently planned to take some of its young residents on a trip to the Efteling theme park on the day of the festival.
Wait, on the same day as the festival where there was trouble last year? That seems counterintuitive.
The source calls it perverse, like rewarding bad behavior instead of setting boundaries or dealing with the integration issues. Marjolaine Faber, a politician, was critical of it too.
How did the public react?
Mixed. There was crowdfunding, apparently raised a lot of money for the AZC kids trip.
Okay, but the source also shared some observations from the village itself.
Yeah, things like seeing a dark-skinned youth on a fat bike, seeing COA and LGBTQ plus flags at the AZC but no Dutch flag, and reports circulating in a local business app group about thefts, allegedly by AZC residents.
With evidence.
Including, apparently, photos of stolen items being sold online.
Right, and someone didn't want to be interviewed.
Yeah, a prominent local agreed initially, then backed out, afraid of threats, basically, from various sides. It suggests a really tense atmosphere.
Yeah, sounds like it. The host in the source shared a bitter social media post.
Yes, expressing disillusionment about the landscape, mentioning modern wind turbines versus traditional windmills, about community issues linked to AZCs, about freedom of speech concerns, just a general feeling of things going downhill.
And the impact of AZCs on communities,
Yeah.
it's complex.
Very. The source tries to balance it, acknowledges negative experiences, but also stresses the goodwill many locals have towards genuine refugees, points out success stories of integration too.
But there's fear. Fear of speaking out.
Yes, fear among white residents of being instantly labeled racist if they raise concerns about problems connected to the AZC.
And a shopkeeper did speak out.
Baki van Dijk, yeah. Voiced concerns about theft, difficulties communicating with some groups of young men from the center.
How did the authorities react to that?
The source is critical of the local mayor, claims the mayor sided against concerned residents, dismissed them as racist, and the new mayor apparently condemned Marjolaine Faber but supported the AZC outing.
So a disconnect between officials and some residents, like that business app group detailing problems versus the mayor's positive spin.
Exactly that disconnect, yes.
And how are these incidents being framed by others? Muslim advocacy groups.
The source says they're using the Sint Anna Paroki situation, Faber's criticism, to claim there's hate, a war against Muslims in the Netherlands, even drawing parallels to Gaza.
Wow. Linking local Dutch issues directly to Gaza.
Yes. A quote is mentioned, possibly from Sinan Khan, connecting Gaza to the experiences of post-colonial migrants in the Netherlands, including a mother saying, "This is what they want to do to us."
They. Who is they?
Good question. The source questions that assumption, pushes back on the idea that everyone in Sint Anna Paroki fits some racist or Islamophobic mold.
Right.
And it asks a pretty crucial question: how long can communities, even welcoming ones, be accused of racism before something breaks, before social cohesion really suffers?
And people thinking of leaving the country.
That sentiment is mentioned too, yeah, people feeling things are heading in a direction they don't like.
So wrapping this all up, the sources paint a picture of, well, quite a few concerning trends.
Definitely. Growing divisions in society, these really intense arguments about rights versus responsibilities, especially in diverse communities, and this potential for fragmentation, communities pulling apart.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about. The original source hosts, they didn't seem to agree entirely on where things are headed.
No, different takes. Which really underscores the role policymakers and the media, too, play in navigating all this. Maybe we do need more aesthetic wind turbines, like the source joked.
And maybe more realistic policy, too.
That seems essential, yes.
Absolutely. Well, plenty for you to mull over there, as always. Think critically, look deeper if you can. Now, I suspect we might get some interesting feedback on this one. Possibly some consequences for tackling these topics head on.
Comes in the territory of a deep dive, I suppose.
It certainly does. Thanks for tuning in.